Well, g'day. It is Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. Welcome back. And of course, Dr. Marcus Ross. Absolutely wonderful to have you again on the channel. Of course, Dr. Marcus Ross is a paleontologist and the owner of Cornerstone Educational Supply in the US. So maybe, Marcus, you can tell us a little bit about what you do, a little bit about Cornerstone, and of course, we're going to actually be talking about the new book today, which I'm excited about. I just read it. I finished it yesterday. Fantastic. So we'll talk about that. So just tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me on again, Ken. It's always a delight to come over to the Creation Unfolding channel. I really enjoy what you do. For those who haven't seen me before, my name is Dr. Marcus Ross, and as you mentioned, I'm a paleontologist. My background is vertebrate paleontology, so I studied the animals with backbones and big teeth. My PhD work was on the group of animals called mosasaurs, which were big swimming marine reptiles. And if you've seen Jurassic World, that big thing that eats sharks, humans, and Indominus rexes, that's my guy. That whole family has about 40 different genera to it, and they're late Cretaceous animals. So always some fun stuff looking at that. In the recent past, in vertebrate paleontology, particularly as it relates to creation issues, I've worked on some papers with Matt McLean, looking at dinosaurs, feathers, and the question of do dinosaurs have feathers? What does that mean for our understanding of them, for our understanding of birds? I also was on a major paper with Todd Wood and Peter Brummel last year at the International Conference on Creationism on the hominid fossil record and an overview of the perspective on human origins from a young Earth creation perspective, and that's going to dovetail very nicely with what we're talking about here today. I taught at Liberty University from 2005 to 2021, teaching earth science, creation studies, paleontology, environmental science, whatever they asked, and stepped down from full-time teaching to run Cornerstone Educational Supply in 2021. So my wife likes to say we're the science stuff people. So when a homeschool curriculum needs science materials, we produce customized sets to go along with those. We work with publishers, distance learning for colleges, all sorts of stuff. Every kind of area within the sciences, we've got some bits and whatnot that we're working with and expanding as we go. So specialization, unsurprisingly, in geological materials for rock, mineral, and fossil materials, earth science kits. But we do the whole gamut of dead frogs and retort stands. In fact, I got one over in the corner here. So all that kind of material.
Great. Yeah. So you need something, especially if you're a homeschooler, Cornerstone Educational Supply. There you go. You got it.
Oh, thanks.
Well, good. All right. Well, so excited. I guess you're excited about this too. So got my copy.
Mine.
Maybe we could just start with, there's 4 views on the historical Adam here. And we'll talk about the authors as we go. I thought we might leave Craig's to last because we've already done a fair decent amount on Craig's perspective, and if we've got time, we'll stick it in at the end there, and we'll do the other 2 views and of course your view first. So maybe you can tell us about your input, what you did, and maybe talk about some of the rebuttals that you got as well. And I did want to drill down on some of the natural evil stuff that you had in the book, because I noticed glaringly that in the responses to your article, not a single one of the 3 actually even didn't even want to touch it when you talked about human cannibalism and murder and things like that, which was, I thought, really telling. So tell us, Marcus, about your chapter and what these guys had to say about it.
Sure. Well, I'll start off by giving a shout out of thanks to William Lane Craig, who invited me to join onto this project at the beginning of 2021. I had actually just told my dean at Liberty University, Dr. Roger Schultz, that I was going to be stepping down at the end of the academic year because I wanted to dedicate more of my time to working with Cornerstone Educational Supply. And, that had risen in my mind as the things that were interesting me and keeping me kind of, mentally focused, and I wasn't quite as interested in my classes anymore. And I didn't want those to slide. I didn't want to just kind of, slouch my way through classes and coast. So one of the reasons why I stepped down from teaching at Liberty University is that between teaching and my school work, between teaching and Cornerstone's work and my family, I didn't have much time to engage scholarly work in creation evolution areas, faith, science, interaction. I was feeling that, opportunity kind of slip a little bit with these two other big things to do. And so, not wanting to squander the training that I've had and the interactions with you and other creationists over the years, decided to pick one of the two ponies and run with them. So it was really fascinating that about 2 weeks after I told my dean, I got this email completely out of the blue from William Lane Craig. Right, I'm looking at my screen like. Click. I know William Lane Craig, but he doesn't know me, right? What's going on? And so it was an invitation to represent a young Earth creation perspective in a forthcoming multiple views book. He was just, finishing and seeing his book about ready to go to publish, and so he wanted another book to start talking about his views, the new views of genealogical Adam that we've talked about on this channel as well, and kind of viewing those as two new entrants into the question of what do we do with Adam. And so he wanted a young Earth creationist. He wanted somebody who was a non-inerrantist, and we'll talk about that with Kenton Sparks. And then he wanted two other positions in the middle. So I'm very grateful to William Lane Craig for sending an invite to me to do that, and that's how I got involved in this. About a year later, we all met, or we were supposed to all meet, at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary for a small conference to present our ideas and get feedback from other scholars who had been invited. So it was, about 20, 25 of us that were there. Myself and Kenton Sparks were the only two who were able to make it in person, because Bill Craig had contracted COVID and pneumonia and was hospitalized just a couple of days before the event. And so it was really touch and go, but praise God, he pulled out of it. Andrew Loke wasn't sure he'd be able to get back into Hong Kong during the COVID restrictions if he left. So he zoomed in for the meeting. And that was kind of, the chance to finally present our ideas, get some feedback from the audience. And then from there, we would then do the interactive parts where we would critique each other's papers in written form, eventually get all of those and write our responses. So that was kind of the idea behind the book. The editor is Ken Keithley, who teaches at Southeastern, who has a long history of work in science, faith, interaction issues, and creation issues in particular. And then there's an afterword by Dr. Joshua Swamidass, who holds a genealogical Adam and Eve view. He's not advocating that in his afterword or anything. He has a nice conciliatory kind of chapter there. So that's the overall structure of the book. We have an intro by Ken Keithley trying to set up the question of Adam and why Adam is the important question right now. And then we have our four views and then an afterword. So in the four views, we've got a non-inerrantist who's going to argue that the Bible is full of errors, and so we shouldn't expect it to be telling us truth claims, historical, scientific truth claims in the Bible. That's Kenton Sparks. And then we got William Lane Craig with his mytho-historical perspective on Genesis 1 through 11, and a deep time genealogical Adam about 750,000 years ago. Next to him is Andrew Loke, who's a philosopher, and he's advocating a recent genealogical Adam and Eve position. For the book, he was asked to defend something like Adam living 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, although he personally prefers a date probably 50 to 100,000 years ago, give or take. But he took up the cause and advocated for that view. And then there was me as the young age creationist, holding to not only Adam as our genealogical ancestor, but as our sole progenitor. No other human beings like him or nothing like him alongside or before. And so that was kind of the structure of the book overall and the types of perspectives that they wanted in there. And this book comes about 10 years or so after a previous Four Views book that was published by Zondervan, was it? Or InterVarsity Press. I think it was InterVarsity Press with their Four Views on Adam. And that had all theologians. So here instead we've got a theologian, two philosophers, and a paleontologist. I mean, it's kind of an eclectic group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Now, your obviously your perspective is a young age creationist perspective. So maybe just give us a quick rundown on that, and then what the points that you wanted to make. I think, as I said, I'd like to drill down on that, the concept of natural evil, and then what the responses were to the young age creationist view and what you thought about that.
Sure. So one of the things that Ken Keithley said in his opening chapter, and as we were in the process of writing, is he wanted us to at least address three topics. We could certainly address other things along the way, but he wanted us to at least touch upon three topics. The first was, what is your view of the scriptures as they relate to Adam? The second was, how does your view of science interact then with your view of the scriptures and who Adam is or might have been? And then third, what does your perspective mean for the work and the ministry of the church? So as I wrote my chapter, I really used those as the three main sections. Decided if he wanted us to talk about this, then this would be how I'd do it. I tend to be a bullet point and linear thinker, so it's Roman numeral 1, sub A, B, C, Roman numeral 2. That's the way I like to do things. And so I really felt like I had a challenging chapter ahead of me. Young age creationism is not well respected in the academy across the board, but even within evangelical academicians, young age creationism is not well received. It's recognized for being a historic position. It's had a long run, but is frequently viewed as one that is an intellectually more lightweight perspective, not filled with nuance and not necessarily paying attention to the closest discoveries from the ancient Near East or what have you, and possibly completely excluded as a possibility from the standpoint of science, right? A multi-billion-year Earth and universe, biological evolution. So for the chapter that I had to write, I felt like I had a lot of work to try to do in a very short amount of time. We were given 6 to 8,000 words for our chapters. So for the readers thinking about this, you're looking at like a 20 to 30 page unit, although they never said anything about footnotes. So I buried a lot of extra stuff in the footnotes. My chapter reads a lot longer as a result. So the way that I approached this was I was not going to justify completely a young earth creationist view of Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4. That wasn't what we were asked to do. What is our perspective is what I was asked to give. So I wanted to run through a fairly robust theological treatment of Genesis 1, 2, 3, and then move into a little bit of Noah and the flood in Genesis 6 through 9, because the human population is reset at that time. So in a sense, we are interested in Adam, but we are also interested in the human population as a whole. And that reset at Noah is going to be important, especially for our scientific evaluations further on, or at least it is for me. Not really very important for anybody else in the book, and we'll explore why. After going through that, and I also had to deal with New Testament passages, and I basically boiled that down to Romans 5, noting that there are some other ones for us to look at, but Romans 5 is the most important. From there, I then had to pivot and start talking a little bit about how young earth creationists think about geologic time. Where do we place the hominin fossil record, which was going to be the majority of the discussion that I would have in science, as post-flood. So while most of the other theologians, philosophers in Christianity that are looking for Adam and wondering where does Adam fit in anthropology, I think they're looking for Adam in the scattered remains of Noah's descendants. Right? If they're looking for Adam among Homo sapiens or between us and Neanderthals down, like Bill Craig says, the nexus point between those two species, he's looking at that and saying that's 750,000 years ago. And you and I would look at that and say, actually, no, that's not only is the timeline wrong, but it's actually post-flood. You're not looking for Adam there. You're looking for Noah's descendants. So that's a strong difference for young age creationists on this. in the scientific discussion, after kind of setting that up and what's the hominin fossil record look like, I describe a little bit about how evolutionists develop phylogenetic trees using cladistics and other methodologies to establish trees. How is that done? And how can young age creationists use these same data sets that are made of good observations and evaluate them in different ways? So I'm introducing a bit of statistical baraminology to the audience and showing them that our methods are actually freer of constraints than the evolutionary cladistic methods are. Evolutionary cladistic methods require that you take this data set of all these different organisms and physical features and you plot them out onto a tree that constantly splits two at a time, two at a time, two at a time. That's the rules and the parameters of any evolutionary tree. If you get a triple split at the base of your tree, that's mathematically unresolved. That's not what the program wants to do. It's saying we don't know enough to be able to tease this out properly. So I said we can take these same data sets and we can evaluate them as people like Todd Wood, Matt McLean, and others have done in baraminology, Kurt Wise, David Kavanaugh, et cetera. And this allows for a freer expression of those data in multidimensional space, like balls floating above a corner. I have a little illustration in there. So like you're looking into the corner of a room and you've got these taxa represented by balls rather than being attached to trees. They're floating in midair and you can kind of see clusterings. And these clusters represent a hypothesis of potential relationship. Just like a cladistic diagram represents a hypothesis of evolutionary relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's important for people to understand. When they see an evolutionary tree, they're not seeing a conclusion. This doesn't prove evolution. It's a hypothesis about how evolution might have worked. In our baraminology study, our hypotheses about who might be part of a created kind, for example. So I have to talk a little bit about that before launching then into how would we test a cluster of organisms around you and I, around Homo sapiens, that seem to be physically similar to us. And I think the way that we can do that is to go to the anthropological record and look at behaviors, artifacts that have left behind that give us a clue into the mental acuity of these different species. And if those cultural artifacts and items reflect the type of cognitive capabilities that we have, and they cluster next to us morphologically, then that seems to be a powerful combination of physical and mental connection that, yes, maybe these are, in fact, people that are humans, descendants of Adam and Eve. And this perspective of a humanity that is bigger than just Homo sapiens has really deep roots in young age creationism. You can find writing all the way back to George McCready Price in 1921 in the New Geology, like the granddaddy of all young Earth creation books. And he's talking about a Neanderthal skeleton from Belgium and talking about it as a human being. So young age creationists have a 100-year legacy of viewing things like Neanderthals as humans. So I had to do a bit of that and kind of describe why we think that some of these individuals are human. So I look at tool making, the use of fire. I look at the ability to travel or voyage overseas, especially, or investigate deep places like caves. A lot of this ended up being part of what I did with Todd Wood and Pete Brummel for the ICC. We built out a little bit more, to this. But these are the sorts of things that I'm looking for higher level cognitive capability, symbolic works, art, those types of things. And as you mentioned, one of the things that after I kind of went through all of that, I said also one of the things that we see is violence amongst these different individuals. And we can see a couple of different examples that I gave in the book, such as the Cima de los Huesos, which translates to the pit of bones, which is in Spain. And there you've got early Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis, either way that you want to call them, but it seems genetically that they're early Neanderthals. And there's at least one very well represented skull that has two massive gashes in the left temple, where it was smashed in the head by a hand axe and assassinated. And that is just one of over 20 different skeletons that's down inside the pit of bones.
Mm.
And there's a single hand axe that was called Excalibur by the excavation team that was found in this pit. Now, there's other bones in there. There's some bare material, and it looks like, there might have been some things coming in and out. But it also does appear that, like, this is down at the bottom of a shaft. It seems like people were killed and then dumped into this. I also give a rather horrifying example of cannibalism from nearby in Spain at Atapuerca, which is geologically even older than that. We're looking at Homo antecessor with this one, and there are flay marks from stone tools all over these human bones.
Time frame. So the time frame is like 800,000 years ago, right? From a
somewhere around there. Yeah, it's even earlier than, say, Craig's view of 700,000 years ago for Homo.
Right. So, which is really important, because what we're saying is this is outside all of the historical Adam views.
Right. So it seems like no matter where you peg Adam, from Homo sapiens or, Homo heidelbergensis or whatever, everywhere that you look, you're seeing evidence of violence.
Yeah.
Person on person violence. And this, is cannibalism sinful, is the question that I ask. Is murder sinful? And worse yet, the cannibalism that we see at Cimo de los Huesos is cannibalism of small young people. It's kids, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, up to later teens. But, people are picking off easy prey. They're snatching children and murdering them and butchering them like any other animal. And in the cave, you also have other animal bones. So this isn't some sort of like desperation cannibalism.
Right.
Because, you're on a desert island, there's nobody left, and you're tearfully crying because you can't believe you've been brought to this level. No, these were people who were going out and snatching kids, among other types of food.
Right.
And so that level of wickedness is something that, as a young age creationist, if we position this post flood, not that I can make sense of what they're doing, but we can make sense of the fact that this is sin in a human community.
And it's important to note too that, as you said, they were using tools to do this, and so the scientists are able to actually see where the scratch marks are in the bones, and so the people, they were humans who were doing this because they were actually cutting where the right ligaments were to cut. So these people
That's exactly right.
Yeah, they knew where to cut, where to flay, where to crack open the bone. So we're not talking about some ape man who doesn't have a mind, is not thinking. We're talking about rational people using tools in an anatomically precise way, right?
Exactly. Yeah, this isn't just grabbing a stone or a big log and smashing bones and nibbling things. They are flaying off the bones at the right, or the meat at the right places in order to extract it. And you can see that on fragments of cheekbones where they're going after this muscle right here, the masseter muscle, right? They're going after bones on the limbs. They're breaking the long bones in order to extract marrow. They know where this stuff is. They know how to get it, and they know how to get it cleanly, which is it's a very disturbing sight.
Yeah,
very, very disturbing. It's very extensive, and so we're left with a difficult question of, when does sin begin? And if you're coming at this from an old age perspective, whether it's old Earth creation or theistic evolution, everywhere you peg, you have somewhere below that this evidence of viciousness and evil, and if we can call that sin, and I think we should, sin can't exist unless Adam is around. Otherwise, you're going to be, pushed into some other positions. And Kenton and I, talk about this in the book a little bit, where you've got to affirm that God is using these kinds of processes in order to build people. That it's okay with him at some point for people to be cannibalistic, to ritually murder or mass murder.
That is good. Right.
And that's part of the good creation. Yeah.
It's got to be good. That's when God says this is very good, what he meant was, according to, Kenton Sparks and other theistic evolutionists, is that it's good for kids to be snatched. It's good for them to be killed, and it's good for them to be cannibalized.
Yeah.
That's what you've got to say. I mean, there's no,
right.
you know?
You've got to end up saying something like, this is the best possible creation we can have. It is good, even if there's bad in it. And, maybe the good outweighs the bad, or, those are some of the different types of options that you might be looking for if that's your position. But it also, I think, has a big problem when you then turn into, okay, well, if you say that these weren't humans, let's just say that they weren't ensouled yet. But at some later point in time, God ensouls people so that this behavior, which was natural and not evil because it wasn't sinful yet, but now that you've been ensouled, you're not responsible, or you're responsible for these types of actions. But you've also been built by a process of evolution that incorporates these things into the way you behave. God used this in order to make you, and now he's telling you, but you can't do it. And kind of the way that I put that is that it seems that God then saddles humanity with a moral and ethical code that completely overwhelms the meager created behaviors that he gave us. You gave us this tendency towards violence, towards wickedness, towards evil, along with other good things. But I give some examples of, there's good, but for every good one, there's also these bad things that we recognize and know in our souls are wicked. And if God all of a sudden says, yeah, and now you can't do any of that, despite the fact that it's woven into who you are,
Yeah.
then the fall becomes inevitable. That doesn't seem where God's giving a real choice. And in this case, it's like, yeah, no, you will fail.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that Kenton Sparks picks out some, what he would say is ethically, he talks about the slavery text from Exodus. A difficult text, undoubtedly, although I think there are ways to resolve it that he did not discuss. He left out verses, I think, that were very important for the context. But even so, he actually says that the writer, the author, was ethically mistaken. He made a mistake, and what he's saying is God is ethically wrong, and that's what he's saying when he says the author made an ethical mistake.
Well, I think, just to play Kenton's advocate there for a moment, is because Kenton's view of inspiration is not at all the same as yours and I's. He views the Bible very much like a series of sermons that you would get on a Sunday. They're being delivered by somebody who loves God, cares about God, and is relating to his flock the things of God. But he would say that God was not speaking directly through the mouth of that writer.
Yeah,
right? So they're making.
I understand he says that. The problem is it's Exodus 20:21 where it says, this is what God says. So I understand his position that ethically it seems inappropriate to him, but at the same time, if that's inappropriate to him or ethically wrong, he's got to embrace what's going on in the Dolina Caves. I don't know. What is he going to make of that situation with cannibalism?
Yeah. Basically, I think he says that's an issue for me, right? In the rejoinder to my response to him. So, each of the authors gets the responses from the other three. Everybody wrote 1,000-word, give or take, to the one author, and then the one author has got 1,000 words to respond back, to everyone. And Kenton basically says, this means we've got more theological work to do, because it is a good point that that an evolutionary perspective, and even to some extent an old Earth perspective, seem to have these issues of building human beings inherently with a bent towards evil. So he kind of recognizes the strength of that argument and has to move on from it.
Did he talk about that in the rejoinder? I don't recall seeing it.
I'm trying to think. I think that he did. Let's see. Okay, yeah, he does. He says it this way on page 65. He says, Ross is absolutely correct on one point. When one accepts the evolutionary origin of humanity, one faces significant theological questions about evil and pain, and God's relationship to them. But that does not mean Ross is correct. It means that we have more theological work to do.
Right. Okay.
So, in a brief reply, and Sparks's reply is fairly quick. Yeah, in fact, the interactions between Sparks and I are rather intriguing. Sparks is just a really nice guy. I really enjoyed the opportunity to meet him when we went to Southeastern. I got a chance to see him again at the Evangelical Theological Society in 2023, where we kind of did a more public presentation of each of these positions and took Q&A from the audience.
Right.
We had a really good time with each other at both of those. He's a man who loves Jesus with all of his heart. He has a strong passion for evangelism. He's the provost of a Christian university. And so, he and I are two who have some very, very different opinions when it comes down to, what the Bible is as far as a communication from God to us and what that means for history and all these things. But his commitment to Christ is something that I certainly don't put into question at all. And so one of the things that's really kind of interesting is that given how different we are on the way that we approach the Bible, as far as its inerrancy and truthfulness in regards to these things, we also read the Bible very, very similarly, right? In his chapter and in some of the responses, he and I both kind of note like, hey, yeah, we both think that the text of Genesis is telling us about a 6-day creation, days as we experience them. We each believed that the author of Genesis believed that Adam and Eve were the first human beings of all sorts and all types of all kinds in all time. That there was a literal fall based on eating fruit from the wrong tree in the garden, and there was a global flood that Cain killed his brother Abel. All those things he believes is exactly what the author of Genesis intended people to understand to be true. He thinks that we can't rely on that as truth, but that's exactly what the author wanted us to think. So in my response to him, I noted kind of a whole bunch of these things and said, the main difference between the two of us is that Kenton thinks this history is incorrect, and I think that it is correct. But we actually agree on what the story is.
Right.
Whereas Kenton replies in one of them, either to me directly or in the rejoinder, more or less that's the case. And what you have is William Lane Craig and Andrew Loke, who are trying to be a little bit more selective about what they think the history versus the non-history happens to be. And they're trying to put something together in the middle in order to avoid being at the margins and the edges, right? And Kenton and I are invited into this because we represent the two furthest ends of the spectrum on this within evangelicalism, or even for Kenton, slightly outside of evangelicalism.
Right.
And Craig and Loke are sitting there trying to say that there's a happy medium that one can find.
Yeah.
And as I've said on another podcast, it turns out that sometimes there isn't a happy medium. Sometimes the truth is actually on one side of something or another.
Yeah.
And if you go and split the middle on it, you've actually not gotten to the truth of the matter.
I think what he's doing is he's acknowledging, as a lot of liberal scholars are these days, that's what the Bible says. People are coming back to say, look, that's just what it does talk about: a global flood. It does talk about a literal Adam. It does talk about a fall into sin. And so these other old earth or even theistic evolutionary positions like Craig's are trying to sort of have the best of both worlds, so to speak. And I just don't think you can. You've either got to be on one side or the other. Now, kudos for Sparks for still being a Christian. But I mean, honestly, for me, I couldn't do that. I think there's no way in the world I could not be able to decide what the scripture is saying is truth and what's not truth. And what do I take from Paul? What do I take from Jesus to be truth and not truth? Because according to Sparks, it's full of error. They're people of their day. They made mistakes, which means I've got to become the ultimate authority in what I decide is going to be truth.
Yeah, and he's doing it in a way that perhaps we wouldn't even expect, right? Because I would say kind of the trope is like, oh, the liberal scholar says the Bible doesn't, say anything that it really says. Science has proved it to be incorrect or what have you. Kenton could kind of care less what science has to say about what the Bible is talking about. Kenton's argument is that if you look at the Bible internally, you're going to find, a whole bunch of problems. And so this idea of inerrancy that we have as evangelicals, fundamentalists as well, but I mean, really the church throughout time, right? The term inerrancy might be a little bit newer, but it's based on a tradition that goes all the way back. But nonetheless, Sparks's approach here is to bring up textual issues that he thinks drive us out of understanding
Right.
the Bible as inerrant, rather than saying that something external to the Bible has forced him out. He's actually saying, no, inside the Bible, I don't think this works. And that I think is going to be very underappreciated by a lot of the folks that read this book. They're just going to kind of not like what Kenton's doing. Not that I like it. I mean, but one of the things that I appreciate about his chapter is that it's a very internally consistent exposition. He's like, this, from inside the Bible, I'm seeing these kinds of problems. Therefore, I can't expect the Bible to tell me about history the way that these folks think that it's going to tell me about history. My hermeneutic with the Bible is not that hermeneutic. And so if science says that we all come from an original pair and that matches with the Bible, oh, that's pretty cool. If science says that there's no way that we came from an original pair, doesn't matter, because I don't think the Bible is able to really tell us, something about that in the first place. So he's doing something rather different than I think what we normally expect. But nonetheless, he's representing a particular perspective that you're not going to run into in evangelicalism, hardly ever,
Right.
because evangelicalism is largely defined by holding on to inerrancy. So when this book has as its subtitle, four perspectives on the historical Adam and Eve, four views, it is, but Kenton self-acknowledgedly says, I stand probably on the perimeter or outside of evangelicalism. So this book is oriented towards evangelicals, and we're including one perspective that virtually everyone is going to have kind of this anaphylactic reaction to, of like, no, I can't go there.
Right.
So that I think is interesting in the way that the book was constructed. And for anybody who wants to read more from Kenton Sparks on the particulars of that, he has a book called God's Word in Human Words. It's a tough book, and he's mellowed as a person a lot. That book is written a little rougher than, say, this chapter was. And but again, now talking with him, I really appreciated him. He was a nice guy. Seems to really love the Lord. But yeah, on this issue, it's a tough pill. It's a really tough pill to try and swallow. And so you've got three other views that they're going to say, no, there's other ways to deal with this. So, given that we've talked at length about Bill Craig's, we should probably jump over and take a look at what Andrew's argument happens.
Yeah, let's do it. So we've looked briefly at your view, and then we switched quickly into Kenton Sparks's view. So let's move on and look at Loki's view.
Yeah, and it's not surprising that we might jump pretty quick off of young age creationism.
Yeah, we're going to jump around a bit because
it's your channel, and you and I are both young earth creationists. So a lot of your viewers are fairly familiar with these kinds of ideas from us. Andrew Loke, as I mentioned, is a philosopher. He teaches at Hong Kong Baptist University, and he is an analytic philosopher, which deals with a lot of evaluation of things through logic, a lot of evaluation of things through. In this chapter, the way that he does is very different from everybody else. So, in Kenton's chapter, he says, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of reasons why inerrancy doesn't work, and therefore conclude that if the Bible talks about Adam and science says there is no Adam, doesn't really matter, because I don't think the Bible can really tell us, the things that it says that it's saying. Bill Craig and myself are going to be a little bit more, let me lay out the specifics of my model of human origins, our theological perspective, our scientific perspective, etc. Andrew's chapter does something rather different. He says, I have a model of human origins in which human beings begin from Adam, but Adam is not the first Homo sapien out there. There are other anatomically identical individuals, but we can't call them human, and they're not made in the image of God. they are animals, even or at least spiritually not human. So Adam is, in his model, still the first human, but he's defining humans as only descendants of Adam, while there are other members of the same species out there. And when Adam and Eve fall and leave the garden and have children, their children then begin to intermix and interbreed with the rest of the population outside the garden, eventually filtering Adam's genealogy in through time as you go from old time to recent, as you and I as geologists always think bottom to top.
Yeah.
As that lineage spreads out and filters into the world around it, eventually at some point in time, every human at a later date has Adam as a genealogical connection. It could have come this way, it could have come straight, it could have come from over here. But at some point later in human history, everybody is descended from Adam, but Adam's just one of their many, many, many great-grandparents out there. Their great-great-great-great-grandparents. So Loke doesn't really kind of spell out precisely how that works. Instead, what he does is says, I have a model, it's a genealogical Adam, quick sketch. Now I'm going to evaluate whether or not that model of human origins is permissible in Christian theology. And so he picks 8 different types of things that he thinks any model of human origins has to check off as a box in order to be a possible model for Christianity. Not necessarily a right model, not a true model, just a possible model. And for a lot of the readers, they're going to have some significant trouble, I think, with this, because Andrew ends up talking about a lot of topics that don't, on the first read, seem to be connected to what we're trying to talk about. So he's going to be asking questions like, does this model of human origins, how does it deal with the generation of human souls? Are all human souls inherited through Adam directly, like we're all human souls in a sense kind of buried inside him and we all get them distributed? Or is God making human souls as human beings are conceived? And there's different theological traditions for both of those. One of them is called creationism, which is really confusing. And the other one is called traducianism. So you get these couple of pages dealing with creationism and traducianism. And, as it turns out, it doesn't matter. Either way, his model is fine with both of them. So check the box, right? And he does that for a whole bunch of different sorts of things. And of course, his model checks all the boxes, right? He chose all the boxes. His model checks all the boxes. So his argument is, my model is possible. Doesn't mean that it's true, doesn't mean that it's real, but it is possible. So Christians can hold it. And it's better than all the other models out there. So it's probably the one you should hold. And if you want to argue against, if you want to try to disprove this model, you not only have to disprove the recent genealogical model that I'm arguing here for, but since there's other genealogical models that are deeper in time, you have to disprove all of those as well. So frequently, as you read the book, you're told basically that the onus is always on you to disprove his idea. Right. And honestly, I find that very frustrating. For you and I, we're both scientists, and for everybody else, honestly, I think, the approach is, you have a hypothesis, you put it forward. It's honestly up to you to defend it.
Yeah.
Against contradictory data, against other ideas. And you don't get to have a multiverse of options that you can always fall back on in order to advance your idea or protect it from possible falsification. But both Andrew Loke and in my conversations with Josh Swamidas kind of view it this way. It's like, no, we have a multitude of possibilities. If you knock this one off, it doesn't matter. I've still got this entire basket full over here. I can throw them out again and again and again. And you see that in the way that Loke also responds to the other people in the book. He very often will say, you misrepresented my view, and maybe we do. But part of that might be that the view is not particularly clearly elaborated. You kind of have to wade through all of the writing to try and pick up and glean what the components of Loke's model happen to be, because it's not just laid out there as as a stepwise, this is what I think. What you're told is basically evolution is true, the Bible is true, there has to be a harmonization, a genealogical model works for this. Now we're just going to go and make sure that it's a possible model. And it checks all the boxes, or the boxes maybe we don't, or have to check this one, like it doesn't matter either way. He went on for 3 pages talking about bestiality, which is a horrible word. Nobody likes talking about this, but if the people outside the garden are not human beings, and Adam's offspring are mating with them and successfully producing children, right? This isn't like the Old Testament ban on bestiality, where you are, engaging in a horrible act with an organism for your own personal pleasure, or for some weird religious ritual, right? These terrible religious rituals of the people around the Israelites. That could never produce a child, but this action does. And in fact, it produces children who have the image of God, maybe, or like partially or fully. He says fully.
Yeah. So just to clarify, for the audience sake, we're talking about, essentially, I think his view is something like there's a pair of hominids taken, put in the garden, given a soul, either that or they're specially created, one of the two. So they're inside the garden. It's a special place, protected place. But outside the garden, there are a whole bunch of different hominids that basically are basically persons, in the sense that they can use tools, they can create art, they have language, all of this, except they don't have souls, right?
And the one distinction that he says between Adam and everybody else is that Adam was created with a right relationship towards God. He can worship God properly. Everybody else in the world, and this would, at that point in time, would be hundreds of thousands, maybe a few million, several million people out there, are not human, even though they're engaged in religious practices and culture. I mean, if Adam is created, say, 10,000 years ago on the conventional timeline, you have populations and civilizations out there. It's not like the evolution of humanity is very recent. It's deep and long, and you've got Homo sapiens that has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. They're biologically identical to the people that God made as Adam and Eve, or selected as Adam and Eve. They will have language and speak and have lives and care and love and all these sorts of things. And he says, but no, they're not humans, because, this one thing of God made a right relationship with Adam.
He even says they can have religion. They could be religious worshippers. And he even says they're rational.
Yes, entirely, right? Because, you could look at something like Göbekli Tepe, which is a large, complex structure made by people for their community. It's a Stone Age society, but don't think like people living in caves. Like, no, they use stone to like build their buildings, and it's a big complex. Thousands and thousands of people living in this area. And if those people don't have the right relationship with God and are outside of the garden, then they're not humans.
Right.
Which is going to make any anthropologist just completely lose their mind.
Right.
To not call them humans.
I think what's sort of blows my mind about this is that God can take Adam and Eve, put them in the garden, and give them a soul. Now, Adam can't kill any of his progeny, but he can go outside the garden and he can kill his mum and his dad and his brothers and sisters and eat them, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and here's another idea, right? Adam is created, Eve is not yet created. He has brought all the animals of the world to name them, and he could be brought members of his very own species, and he looks at them and says, that's not a match for me. That does not connect to me.
Right.
The whole point is that Adam sees the animals and notes that the animals are different. And then Eve is created, and she's the same. She is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine, right? You wake up, you're Adam. God's going to say, okay, I'm going to show you everything. And you look at everything, including women, and you go, yeah, there's nothing out there that matches me. That just, that is, I don't really have a good category for the type of way that I find that incredulous.
Yeah, I think
Um,
this view of
and that's
Loki.
just the way that it's got to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole genealogical Adam and Eve has got some real issues when it comes to this perspective with the image of God and the non-image of God and how that works out.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and one of the reasons that Loke has kind of takes this position that everything outside the garden, no matter if it's someone who's talking on a podcast like you and me, right, having a full intelligent conversation, doesn't matter. They're not human because they didn't come from Adam. The reason that he's kind of boxed into that position is that he recognizes that Genesis 1 on the sixth day is describing the events that are talked about in greater detail in Genesis 2. So for him, when God makes Adam and Eve, that is when he makes man and woman in his, male and female, he creates them, right? So he recognizes the unity of Genesis 1 and 2. Joshua Swamidass, on the other hand, he looks at Genesis 1 as an event that precedes Genesis 2. So for Josh Swamidass, he doesn't have exactly this problem for the genealogical model because he can say everybody that is made through evolution is made in the image of God. And Adam is simply a covenantal relationship. He still has the problem of how does sin get, comported to everybody. And in his book, right, he lays out a bunch of possibilities and says, pick your choice. It doesn't matter. It's all good. It's all going to work out. I don't think so. But because Loke recognizes Genesis 1 and 2 as being synchronic, right, in the same time, he's got to do something about all the people that aren't Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And so for Josh, you gain the image of God for all the people outside the garden if you look at Genesis 1 as prior to Genesis 2. But then you run into problems like Genesis 5 that puts them together, or Jesus's claim to the Pharisees that puts them together.
Yeah.
And you have to find your way around those verses, and that's not easy. Loke's like, I don't want to do that. So what I'll do is I'll just make everybody outside the garden non-human.
Right.
But that brings up, right, this problem of mating with non-humans, of categorizing people who are exactly like you in every way, save this one thing that you can't test for, right? There's no archaeological, anthropological test that can tell if a particular group of people had a right relationship with God until you get to, worshiping Yahweh as the Jewish people do. So you can't test prior to, the second millennium BC. Before that, there's no way to adjudicate this. And Andrew, says, no, you can tell the difference. Like, no, you can't. There's no way to scientifically look at that.
Right.
And to go through, long discussions on the creation of human souls, or whether humans can mate with non-humans, and even if they do, is it sin or was it something God wanted, and come to no conclusion, right? At the end of those 3 terrible pages, there's no conclusion. You kind of go, I don't think that a model that comes to no conclusion as to whether or not Adam and Eve could mate with non-humans is something that is viable for Christianity. I appreciate that Andrew wants a historical Adam. I really do.
He's got a good view of Scripture.
He does. And I was talking with some other folks one time at a homeschool meeting, actually, as I was kind of laying out the different origins positions, not even historical Adam so much, but just origins positions: young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, theistic evolutionists. And young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists frequently argue with each other the hottest. We just really fight with one another. And the reason is because we share a very similar to near identical hermeneutic, right? We both approach the text as something that is inerrant, that should be read in a historical, grammatical approach. And then we have these, differences on the details that drive us in a few different directions. But we're like cousins at a family gathering. And when we get together, a lot of times we have fun, but a lot of times we also bicker like crazy. Whereas someone like Kenton Sparks, who is not an inerrantist, is like a distant cousin that we don't really see very often. And when we get together, we don't just want to argue and fight. Maybe we do, but we don't argue and fight nearly so much because we're not in the pews together.
Right.
We don't attend the same types of churches as Andrew and I would attend similar kinds of churches, no doubt. So I think that's important for the for the folks watching here to kind of think of, oh yeah, the reason why, young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists have fought so much is because, we're in the pew
Yeah,
together.
we're very similar.
And we've got these minor differences ultimately that we both think matter in big
Yeah.
ways. But yeah, so, Andrew and I share a lot more in common in the way that we think scripture ought to be read and ought to be approached. And the rationality behind scripture and its trustworthiness, all of those things are things that he and I share a lot.
Yeah.
And a little less the case with Craig, but close.
Yeah.
And then very distant with
Yeah.
someone like Kenton.
Right. Excellent. Well, look, we're in some time here. I don't know. It's up to you if you want to hash out a bit of Craig's view. Or
Well, I think maybe what might profit us, because we've got a whole 2 videos that we've done with Craig, right?
Yeah.
Is to maybe look at a couple of the critiques that went back and forth with Craig and I, because I think those would be the sort of thing like, hey, those weren't covered in previous episodes. So in my response to Craig, those are things that we did talk about on the channel, right? We both kind of looked at his 10 components of myth. And really, I think they boil down to just 2. He thinks that etiologies, the origin of things, is something that's kind of part and parcel of myth. And yeah, myths do deal with etiologies, but so do other historical components. Genesis is rife with etiologies. It probably has more etiologies than any other single book in the Bible, maybe save one other. Because the origin of why places are named this way, or why is something called this, or what have you. Genesis just filled with them. It's the beginning, right? Why is this well called, this, and where is it? So etiologies don't, they are something that you see a lot in myth, but they're also things that you see in historical writings. So this one's a little weak, but I can see it as a qualifier. But really, the big one for Craig is the fantastic elements and what he calls palpably false statements. And the idea that God created the world in 6 days, he says, is palpably false and fantastic. God walking around as a humanoid deity is fantastic. A snake that talks is fantastic. So he kicks all of these out. And so I bring up those challenges that the original authors might not have considered these things fantastic, and all of these other 10 items, most of them don't qualify for adjudicating myth versus non-myth. And on the science end of things, I said that you should probably expand your perspective of who gets counted as human more broadly, rather than just Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and everything that connects within that network. But there's good reason to think that Homo erectus, for example, would qualify as human. And you and I did a video about that topic as well.
Yep.
So in Craig's response to me, especially to my chapter, one of the things that was interesting I found was that both Andrew Loke and William Lane Craig criticized me for not producing a full defense of young Earth creationism. I didn't deal with distant starlight. Craig tells me I should have dealt with how marsupials got to Australia.
The book on historical Adam, wasn't
that's Ken Colson's issue. He lives there. Go ask him.
Wasn't it about Adam, the book?
Yeah, it kind of was. And so I reminded the audience of that in my rejoinder. I was not asked to give a full defense of young age creationism. I was supposed to describe, my perspective on Genesis, and my perspective on Adam's historicity. So it wasn't intended to be a full defense of young age creationism. That would be a different book, right? There are 4 view books and multiple view books on that. You can read Ken Ham and his defense of young age creationism in an InterVarsity 4 Views book. And, it's got Hugh Ross and it's got Deb Harzma and Stephen Meyer representing the different perspectives. It's a fine book. If you're going to look for a multiple views book on that, that's good. It's recent. It was 2017. That wasn't what this book was about. And Craig liked some of what I did with my argument about Abram's historicity in Romans 4, which leads into Adam's historicity in Genesis 5. He says I should have developed that more. It's like, well, I developed the argument for Abram rather well and said this applies to what we see in that. So Craig's Craig's critiques, I really didn't find to be very strong. I was really hoping for more. Instead, Craig kind of throws out a standard litany of arguments against young age creationism generally.
Mm.
And he then falls back to, well, if your view on the New Testament is that we have to believe every statement refers to a historical situation, then, we've got to go with Jans and Jambres, and we've got to go with Michael the archangel fighting Satan over Moses's body. And these come from non-biblical books.
Mm-hmm.
So we can ignore your other examples. Like, well, no, you actually have to deal with the example given and justify why that doesn't count, right? I gave an argument for why it does count as historical.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just say, well, there are other ahistorical things out there that we'd actually have to argue about, and say that because of that, I can toss this one.
Mm-hmm.
It was a breezy response, actually.
Yeah.
Andrew Loke did much better. One of the things I did appreciate about Andrew is in his interactions with the other chapters, he was aggressive, but he was diligent, very diligent in reading everybody carefully, coming up with particular critiques that he thought were important. Andrew did not play with kid gloves in this. And I think he's to be respected for that, as much as I don't agree with his position. And I think that his chapter is a difficult one for the audience to grasp. It's difficult even for those of us who are writing to kind of understand. And you see Kenton writing about that.
Mm-hmm.
I do credit him as being very formidable in the Q&A and bringing out just a lot of issues. So, that would be kind of, I dealt with a lot of Craig's stuff in other videos with you and a few other places. But I really wish that Craig would have treated young age creationism more seriously. He doesn't view it very seriously, and I understand that. He's never held the position. He doesn't think it's important.
Well, he's very clear
but
at
I
the end
don't
of
think
his
that
critique. He says that we live in a different planet.
Yes.
Because we believe in rapid geologic processes, rapid biological diversity, and a lot of natural processes that, at today's rates of change are certainly going to be quite amazing. But because of that, we live on a different planet. But then again, I could easily quote other texts in scripture, especially in the book of Revelation. I know it's a very symbolic book, but still there's a lot going on the earth regarding natural processes that are going to be pretty amazing one day. So it's not that they're impossible. It's just that we haven't experienced them. And understandably, there's credulity there.
And for Craig also, a couple of his critiques of young earth creationism really flew far from the mark, because it was very obvious that he hadn't read anything substantive from young earth creationism. So, for example, he says that young age creationists have to have all plate tectonics movement happen after Noah's flood. And it's, as I replied, like, I don't know any young age geologist who has ever made that kind of argument. That's simply not the way that young earth creationists have looked at geology in the past 40 years, right? Let's say since, or at least 30 some years since catastrophic plate tectonics was advanced at ICC in 1994. So 30 years ago, there's a long tradition in history of young age creationists talking about plate tectonics happening during Noah's flood, not afterwards. And I think this is just an unfortunate situation where what Craig knows most about young age creationism is coming from the people who interact with him through the Facebook page of Reasonable Faith, which are not academic young age creationists. They're just kind of average folks who've been reading from like all sorts of things or watching some YouTube videos. And so Craig's not thought young age creationism was worth the time and effort to learn what they think about before critiquing. I mean, I know he's read a couple of things here and there. If you read his book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, he read Jonathan Sarfaty's commentary on Genesis, which is a substantial work. But aside from that, he's read a couple of multiple views chapters from theologians, and that's pretty much it. A paper from Jason Weil or Russ. Actually, not even Jason Weil. He read, Starlight in Time by Russ Humphreys, some couple of decades ago. So I really wish that Craig would have risen to the occasion the way that he can on something like this.
Right, updated his views. All right, good. Well, look, we are definitely out of time. We've gone over time. So for the audience, there's the book. All right. Actually, it's not a huge book. It's a couple hundred pages. But it's a great book. It's challenging. There's a lot of challenging aspects in the book that people raise. But if we're serious about really wanting to know what the scripture has to say, I think it's a great book. So go and grab that. Well, Marcus, I think we'll call it quits there. Again,
hey, thanks. Time flies on this channel.
What's that?
Time flies on this channel, Ken.
It does.
It's always
flies.
a joy.
I mean,
it's always a joy
amazing.
talking with you.
It's been fun. It's good. Nutted out a lot of good stuff. So again, thank you. And I don't know what we'll discuss next time, but we'll talk about that. So we will see you again soon. So Dr. Marcus Ross, thank you. Thank you for being on the channel.
Absolutely.
All right. And yes, so that's all from me, Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. Again, don't forget, pound that like button, subscribe, ring the bell. Prayer, always appreciate prayer. I've got that in at the end of my videos each time. There is a link there if you'd like to give as well. And we will see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.